Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform, for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
So here we are, and I'm going to start tonight at rearranging things a bit. I'm going to put the talk first for reasons that I think will become clear to you, and we'll follow on with the guided meditation. So the topic of my talk is the seeming meditation, the seeming paradox that is at the heart of the Buddha's teaching. The seeming paradox at the heart of the Buddha's teaching. And I've got to say, in a way, I've been talking about this without calling it a paradox, I guess, for years, whatever. But tonight I have identified it as a paradox. And I've talked about it before. I've talked about it with reference to other traditions, sometimes poetically. Tonight, what I'm going to do is to really take a dive into the Pali Canon. And I'm going to be quoting a good deal of the Buddha's own words. So I would just say, this isn't about the Pali Canon. It's not about learning big, difficult comments. It really is about what the Buddha taught, why he taught it, and why it's applicable really to all of us. And it doesn't matter what our backgrounds are. You don't need a lot of background for this. It's really applicable to all of us. So for the paradox, just to start right with that. On the one hand, the Buddha's teachings, the Buddhadharma, the Buddha's teachings, examine minutely the workings of the mind. I think we all know that. And I will just give you one quote from the Dhammapada that makes it so clear, in which he says, all actions are led by the mind. Mind is the master, mind is the maker. Act or speak with an impure mind, and suffering will follow as the cartwheel follows the foot of the ox. And then goes on, all actions are led by the mind. Mind is the master, mind is the maker. Act or speak with a pure state of mind, and happiness will follow as your shadow follows you without departing. From the Dhammapada, one of the earliest of the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha focuses a great deal on how to live daily life. He gives tools for living with clarity, with compassion, and hence the practices of mindfulness and concentration and all the heart practices that we have been focusing on at IMCC. And also following on the implications of what the Buddha's teachings are that we have been talking about a good deal, the psychological implications, the neuroscience, the engagement, social justice. All of these are ways in which the Buddha either directly speaks about or the implications, direct implications of how to live a happy life, a clearer life. It's for all of us. I thought of it, how to grow a happy life. And these teachings make sense. And I think that our feeling about them is that, we got something solid to work with. And the Buddha has left instructions how to go about doing that. Yes, all of it is true and important. And I think we all know that. But there is, or I will say, and there is another aspect to the teaching. And that is what we can call the ultimate teaching. There are other teachings in the Pali Canon that can seem so elusive. And they can seem anything but solid. They seem to be abstract, hard to grasp. And again, they can be called the Buddha's ultimate teachings. I'm going to give you a wonderful quote, and this is a response of the Buddha, and it appears in the connected discourse, the Samyutta Nikaya, in which the Buddha is responding to a young Brahmin student who's asking, said, well, amidst all of this change, everything is changed and impermanent, what is solid? And here's the Buddha's response. And he said, I will tell you where to find solid ground. There is an island an island which you cannot go beyond. It is a place of nothingness, a place of non-possession and of non-attachment. It is the total end of death and decay. And this is why I call it Nibbana, or Nirvana. Nibbana is Pali, Nirvana, Sanskrit. So the question is, does that sound solid to you? Well, I don't think it sounds solid, but the Buddha did. He called it solid ground. And he knew that these teachings were hard to understand. And I will say they were hard to understand in his day, and they're still hard to understand in our day. And he knew that. Shortly after the Buddha, or I'll just say after the Buddha awakened, but before he began to teach, he had some thoughts. And we know he had these thoughts because later on he communicated them to, I guess, Ananda, I don't know, some of his followers. But here's his comment. It appears in the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, number 26. It's called The Noble Search. And here's what the Buddha said about his an inner debate that he had after enlightenment before he started teaching. He was talking to himself or thinking, this Dhamma, and Dhamma is the Pali word for Dharma, this Dhamma that I have realized is profound, hard to see, and hard to understand. It's peaceful and sublime. It's unattainable by mere reason. But this generation delights in worldliness. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth. If I were to teach the Dhamma, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. And I love that. He thought, oh, do I really want to go to all this trouble? And I think all of us are infinitely grateful that he decided, yes, he would do it. And he did it for about 40 years, all that trouble. When we read the scriptures, for those of us who do, when we hear the teachings, it's so easy, depending what we're listening to get the impression that there are two different speakers, two different people. And what came to my mind in thinking about this, it's like the story of the blind man rubbing the elephant. We all know that. I think we've all heard that story, blind man rubbing different parts of the elephant. I looked it up in the original form, and according to it, the story, one man's rubbing the head said it was like a jar. Another man rubbing the tusk of the elephant said it's like a plowshare. I don't know what a plowshare is exactly, but in those days, I'm sure everybody did. The body, like a granary. The foot, like a post. So the point is that all of these were only partial perspectives. They weren't the whole picture. And the same thing is true. The same thing is true with the Buddha's teachings. The Buddhadharma, his teachings, are both his everyday teachings and his ultimate teachings. I want to read you a comment about this, and it appears in a publication called Bodhi Leaves from the Pali Text Society. It's an older publication. It was written in the 20th century, but by J.F. McKechnie, and he was a monk, Bhikkhu Silakara. It was just released last year as an audio book. It's called The Buddha's Two Voices. And here's what J.F. McKechnie said. The Buddha had two ways of speaking to people. At one time, he would address them in words that would express the utmost of his knowledge. At other times, he would tell them simple things within the compass of their ready understanding and words that would take the form of ordinary speech used among themselves. In both modes of speech, he spoke what was true. But in the former mode, he spoke what was final, ultimate truth. In the latter mode, he spoke what was true for the people at the time into which he spoke. This statement by McKechnie, it isn't kind of a statement on the fringe. It was, as I said, it's a publication called the Bodhi Leaves, Pali Text Society, which is right up there with Bhikkhu Bodhi. I don't think we hear about it much these days. It began in the 19th century with, I assume it was English, in Sri Lanka. It is based there for a long time, putting out Bodhi Leaves, little statements by experts in the Theravadan tradition. And I know at the Bhavana Society, where I lived for a year, their library is filled, a whole stack of them in the shelves. So Bodhi leaves. So this kind of idea that Mikeshni is saying about the two voices, I think we can take it as, yep, that's the way it was. So why did this Buddha speak with two voices? And it is, I'm obviously, because in addition to being an enlightened being, he was a genius of a teacher. He was a genius of a teacher. He spoke to where people were coming from according to their interest and level of understanding. He wasn't trying to confuse people, but I think he was doing two things. Number one, he wanted to make daily life easier for people using skillful means, the practices that we know and we're familiar with. But number two, what he wanted to do was to lead them on, to point to his ultimate teachings for those who chose to go there. I love the term that Joseph Goldstein used when he was talking about in One Dharma about the Buddha's teachings. He called it onward leading. And this is, I think, a reference to what he was pointing to, the Buddha. I'm going to read you again from the Mikechni, Bodhile's Two Voices of the Buddha. He said, when the Buddha is asked a question which is not concerned with ultimate truth, but with practical everyday life, then he says, there is a world and you have a good deal to do to find your proper place therein and make proper use of your stay there. There is a world and there is a beyond the world. And I have to show you how to make your way from one to the other. So some of us may choose to make our way from one to the other, or wish to make our way from one to the other. Some may not, all is well. But this is why we call the path in the Theravadan tradition a graduated path. That is, there is a progression, starting on one level and pointing to another. I see no place is it maybe more obvious, this graduated path, than when the Buddha is talking about consciousness. The two voices are really, really clear when he talks about that. He spoke both in terms of everyday consciousness, that is consciousness of objects, and he also talked about pure awareness, which later on was called Buddha nature, and that's consciousness without objects. And I want to explain this, what this means. First of all, consciousness with objects, or consciousness of objects. We all know what it is. It's our everyday consciousness. It's everything we see, we hear, we touch. Whether it's a tree or a chair, a computer, another person, the sky, whatever it is, consciousness of objects. Now, most people aren't even aware of it, as we know. Most people will react automatically. They see an object, whether it's a situation or a physical object, and they'll go toward it if they like it and away from it if they don't. We, as practitioners of mindfulness, know, oh, we have developed skillful means. We don't just automatically act on automatic with regard to objects. Still, both groups, those who are on automatic, and we, when we are in our everyday minds, consciousness of objects, we both of us are being animated by consciousness of some object. Let me say a little more. I hope it'll be clear. We all know there are 5 sense spaces: eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. That's what the Buddha called them, sense spaces. We call them sense organs. The Buddha was with us, or we were with the Buddha up till there. So what he taught was that a sense object impinges on a sense organ. And then when that happens, there is sense consciousness. I'll give you an example. A beautiful sunset, glorious colors. Okay, that's the sense object, the glorious sunset. It impinges on one of our sense organs, the eye. And it is registered by us by eye consciousness. For every organ, there is a consciousness, the Buddha taught. excuse me, there's a consciousness for every organ. Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, or mouth consciousness, and body consciousness. In addition, the Buddha said there is a sixth organ, and that is the mind. The mind is an organ or a sense base, just as the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body are. The object, according to the Buddha, the object of mind consciousness is thoughts and emotions. It was at the time, or in the scriptures, called formations or mental formations, but he's talking about thoughts, emotions. And this is really interesting when you start thinking about it. The mind is an organ. You know, we usually think of the mind as that which records everything else that's going on. And the Buddha said, hey, it's just one of the now six. So mind consciousness and its objects are the thoughts that arise and the emotions that arise. So if you give to give a more concrete explanation, if a thought arises, it means that the thought impinges on the organ of the mind, and mind consciousness arises. Does that make sense? Anybody, would you nod if that makes sense? I could say more. Thank you, Chuck. I just happen to see Chuck Bruce right here. Appreciate that. Okay. You know, it's so much easier when you're standing in front of people, you can read them, but here everybody's just kind of sitting or don't have the screen on and you just have no idea. Okay, that's the mind is an organ. Now, the Buddha's message about consciousness of objects, we know that in daily life, our consciousness is constantly being bombarded by objects. I mean, just constantly, everything we look, we think, we hear, our mind is really busy, both internally, the thoughts, the emotions, and externally, with all these objects that are continually occupying our attention. So continually, you know, many of us are overwhelmed a lot of time. So these objects can spark, as we all know, I mean, I'm just saying what's so obvious, it's just hardly need to say it, but just to make it familiar in with this new terminology. This consciousness, mind consciousness, and the objects can spark everything from joy to grief and everything in between. It all interacts together. And all of us are experts in that department. So I'm hoping what consciousness of objects that the Buddha spoke about all the time means, and is clear. I want to move on to the other kind of consciousness, and that's consciousness without objects. This is the Buddha's second voice. This is his ultimate teachings, consciousness without objects. And this is what he identified as the end of suffering. In a few minutes, I'm going to give a couple of quotes to illustrate from the Pali Canon about consciousness without objects. But this is hard to grasp in English, in just plain English, much less in translated from the Pali. So I'm going to try to say a few words, maybe to clarify consciousness without objects a bit. First of all, I'll say it might sound obscure, abstract, elusive, but in fact, every one of us has experienced it. Consciousness without object. We just don't recognize it. Why? Consciousness without object is the space between thoughts. It may be a mere nanosecond, but between the stream of various consciousness, any moment in between, which we've all experienced to some degree or another, is consciousness without object. We don't usually notice. Why? Because our attention is too busy with the objects. In fact, the mind skips over and engages with objects. That nanosecond, or however long in between, is like a non-event as far as the mind is concerned, the thinking mind is concerned. And it's not to blame the thinking mind. because the intellect can't do anything else. It's got to grab onto an object of some sort, whether it is a physical object like a chair or a computer or a desk or whatever, or a thought or emotion. Those are objects too, remember. Those are mind. Those are the objects of the mind consciousness. So like, for example, right now, I'm talking about consciousness without objects. That's a thought. It is not the same as consciousness itself, consciousness without object. The thought is not the same as the actual experience. The mind, thinking mind cannot grasp consciousness without objects. Why? Because it is without object. It has no distinctions. It is timeless, spaceless. It's never been born. It's always here. It never dies. It's unchanging. It's pure. Terms that you have heard a million times. I've certainly said them often. I'm sure you've heard them elsewhere. Your Buddha nature. We sometimes talk about your Buddha nature. That is the consciousness without object, when it's not engaged with object. Okay, so I'm saying the thinking mind can't understand that, but there is something within us that can. What is that something? There are a lot of names for it. The truth is we can't put any name for it. It's there. We can call it, I usually call it heart. It's not physically the heart, any location. Some people call it the intuition or the gut, but all of it's metaphorical. All of it is just words that cannot actually point to what it is. But I think every one of us has experienced it. I think we've all experienced that sense that there's something more, that things haven't come to completion yet. There's something in addition. There's something, maybe we'll call it missing. And that sense that there is something more, that is consciousness without object, which in fact we know profoundly. We just don't know. Our mind doesn't know that we know. Something else knows that we know. So maybe to make it a little bit clearer, I use an analogy. I didn't make it up. I got it from someone. I don't remember what. But talking and comparing this consciousness without objects, the fleeting moments when we may experience it directly in between thoughts, and comparing that, or making the analogy with a patch of blue in an overcast sky. Envisioning the sky as overcast with clouds from one end to the other. And there's one spot where the clouds are broken, a little spot. And in that little spot, you see the baby blue of the sky. Now from the ground, if we didn't know any better, we'd look up and we'd think, okay, the nature of the sky is this gray stuff up there. All of us do know better. So we know that in fact, that's not true. If we went up to those clouds and through the baby blue hole, we would be in a whole new environment, spaceless, timeless, without any kind of object. That is the space of sky, the area of sky. And I'm trying to make an analogy here with this space between thoughts. It may seem a nanosecond, if you even have captured it, but in fact, when we go into it, or when we experience it directly, we know that it is the same as the sky. It is what is primary. And all these other objects that we see and consciousness is usually occupied in a conventional level, that's not primary. So once this is directly experienced, and I know some of you know this, I know that, once this is directly experienced, and I'm talking about consciousness without objects, the objects that seem to be in the foreground of our attention, and that's everything, every object you can name, there's a shift. And suddenly you realize that the consciousness without objects is actually the foreground, is actually what always exists. It is the ground. and everything else is within it, like the clouds are within the sky. Knowing that, experience that, is a huge relief. It's an huge opening up. And it's what the Buddha was pointing to. It's what he was pointing to. And I would just say what he was pointing to doesn't mean that you lose the ability to perceive objects, not at all. You can perfectly perceive them, but you know that they're not the whole story. That's what happens. That's the experience. So words cannot describe that experience. We can point to it. The Buddha pointed to it. I said words can't describe it. The Buddha tried for 40 years to describe it, you know, and he talked about it. And he talked about it in the Pali Canon. He talked about consciousness without objects. And the problem is, first of all, it was language that is archaic, 2,500 years ago. Second of all, it can't be expressed anyway. So it's a hard job for us to really catch hold of it. But I'd like to talk about two ways the Buddha talked about in the Pali Canon about consciousness without object. Number one, he spoke about cessation. And I want to give you a quote. Constantly cessation. And I don't know if you could read some of the quotes from the Pali Canon, you read cessation, you say, what? So what does that mean? All right, so what it's talking about is cessation of consciousness. That is cessation of attention to objects. A cessation of consciousness of objects. And again, here is a quote, and again, from the middle length discourses, just the discourse on right view. And this is a quote from Sariputta, his main disciple, his foremost disciple. And I'm going to spare you a lot of repetition because there is a lot. But in this, he says, there are these 6 classes of consciousness. And then he goes on and talks about the 6. I just delineated, starting with eye consciousness and ending up number 6 with mind consciousness. He relates all of them. And then he said, with the arising of formations, and that means with the arising of thoughts and emotions, with the arising of formations, there is the arising of consciousness. Again, that's mind consciousness. With the cessation of formations, with the cessation of thoughts, like the space between thoughts, with the cessation of thoughts, there's the cessation of consciousness. And then skipping over some words, he says, when a noble disciple has understood this, has understood thus consciousness, he here and now makes an end of suffering. Now, there are a lot more words around this, but this is the cessation, talking about consciousness without object. And not easy to understand. So I'm just going to pass on. I read it and, you know, hopefully you heard it, but okay, let's move on to something that I think is clear. Consciousness without objects. He says it, it's said much more clearly, I think, in another scripture. And that's the Anathapindika scripture, also in the middle length discourses, advice to Anathapindika. And I want to give you some background here because it's so moving. Anathapindika was the Buddha's foremost benefactor. He was a man who was extremely wealthy, and he met Buddha when he was a young man and when the Buddha was just starting out in his teaching mission. And immediately, and there's a lot of information in the scriptures about it, immediately he was captivated, captured, and he began to give all kinds of things to the Buddha, including what became legendary, the Buddha's most, well, I say magnificent monastic park. They didn't call them monasteries yet. This was called Jeta's Grove in this capital city of Savatthi. It was huge. I mean, a big story about it. I'm not going to take time now to tell it, but it's really a moving story. Anathapindika gave so much money that he ended up, by the end of his life, impoverishing himself. So this scripture actually begins at the very end of Anathapindika's life. He's dying. And he's up in Savatthi, which is the capital of one of the major kingdoms at the time. The Buddha's major disciple, again, Sariputta and Ananda, his foremost advisor, were both visiting Anathapindika as he was dying. And they inquire, how is he? And he said, he's in great pain. He's in tremendous pain. And they talk a little bit. And then Sariputta offers some teaching to Anathapindika with the hope of alleviating, helping him as he makes his passage. And here is what he says, talking about Sariputta. He said, you should train yourself thus. My consciousness will not be dependent on the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind, going with those. And I will not cling to, and then he goes through each of the 6 consciousnesses again. I will not cling to material form. I won't cling to feeling, our perception, our mental formations, emotions, thoughts. I won't cling to consciousness. My consciousness, and here's what he ends up with as advice. My consciousness will not be dependent on consciousness. Like what? My consciousness won't be dependent on consciousness. He is talking about no objects. He will touch into consciousness without objects. I think this is about, it is really when you get into it, that sentence can blow you away. He said a whole lot more to Anathapindika, but consciousness will not be dependent on objects. That's how you should train yourself. Discover that. First of all, it sounds, when we hear it and listen to it, it sounds like it's impossible. What does that mean? I have to get rid of all my senses? You know, what does that mean? Go into some sensory deprivation space? You know, do I have to will away all of my senses? And the answer is no, that's not possible. You can't do that. But it is talking about pure awareness of what later was called Buddha nature, because it already exists. You don't have to manufacture it. All you have to do is relax into what is already there. Whether we notice it or not, it's there and you cannot lose it. So Anathapindika, on his deathbed, heard all this. And he understood. He had this great opening as this monk was talking to him. And what did he do? He complained. He complained to the monk. And he said, I haven't heard that before, that teaching. And here's a quote. He said, although I have long waited upon the teacher, talking about the Buddha, and his monks, they never shared that teaching. I think he was angry. I think that Anathapindika on his deathbed was angry. So Sariputta, his Buddha's disciple, leading disciple, responded, well, he said, such teaching is usually only given to monastics. And those people, and he called it those who have gone forth, monastics. And my own interpretation is, I think Sariputta recognized, I'm in hot water here. You know, he was saying something that here was this man who had given his life and his finances certainly to the Buddha, and he was upset. And at any rate, this is the explanation. We don't usually tell people this, lay people this. Anathapindika did something, again, that is extraordinary. First of all, you need to recognize lay people did not speak back to monks. I mean, we may have a less, inhibition on that these days, although I think we also have some kind of hesitation, but by golly, back then, whatever the monk said, that was it. But here he was on his deathbed speaking up and said, you should tell lay people. I've never heard it before. And now after Sariputta explains, well, we don't usually say these things. Then he went on and Anathapindika replied, well, you should, he said. Now that's not the quote. He said, but here's the quote. Let this talk be given to lay people. There are clansmen with little dust in their eyes who are wasting away through not hearing such talk on the Dhamma. there will be those who understand. And I find this just so poignant, saying it's no different today, is it? So this was the advice to Anathapindika, the sutta, the scripture. To my knowledge, and I'm not a scholar, so I don't know for sure, but my impression is that most Theravadan monks in Buddha's day and afterwards did not follow Anathapindika's advice. I don't think most of them, I think most of them did not teach pure awareness to people, to the lay people. But later on, there were schools of Buddhism that arose and did, like Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. But today, jumping forward to today, both voices of the Buddha and his ultimate teachings are available to us. We don't need to be dying to hear them. And I would say that in our times, these ultimate teachings have filtered into our tradition, the Theravadan tradition, fairly slowly. Most of our focus has been on the first voice of the Buddha, the practical everyday teachings, and that's fine, that's good. But in the late 1990s, Ajahn Amaro, whom some of you know of and maybe have heard him teach, he's a Buddhist monk. He and a Tibetan monk got together and led a retreat at Spirit Rock out in California. And they discussed the ultimate teachings. And the result in the early 2000s was a book called Small Boat, Great Mountain. The first chapter in that book is called Ultimate and Conventional Reality, the two voices of the Buddha. Well, I'll say that book caused quite a stir in Theravadan, Western Theravadan circles. Like, hey, wait a minute, we don't talk about that. Or this is outside of what we usually talk about. There's a lot of grumbling. Now, I will say Ajahn Amaro, who is the Theravadan monk, is actually from the Thai forest tradition. And their teaching, that's Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Buddhadharma, Thai forest tradition, always taught these things. It is the Burmese tradition, which we have inherited mainly and has really been spread in the Western world mainly, that has focused rather on the conventional teachings. So that was kind of a beginning in terms of the opening up of these teachings in the Theravadan tradition. These days, many Theravadan teachers are trained in other traditions. One example, I trained in Zen for a lot of years. But increasingly, Theravadan teachers, even those who have not trained, are using phrases like Buddha nature, which is consciousness without objects. It's consciousness without objects. I will say that in a few days, later on this month, I mean, like in the middle of this month, in less than a week, Tara Brach has got a new book that's being published, coming out in a few days. And the title of that book is Trusting the Gold, Uncovering Your Natural Goodness. And in this book, one of the things she will be talking about, she does talk about, is Buddha nature. I don't know, because the book isn't released yet, I don't know if she calls it consciousness without objects, but that's what it is. That's the heart of it. Those are just words to describe Buddha nature. So here we are now, and I'm kind of reaching toward the end of this talk. And maybe for you, it's not of interest, Buddha's ultimate teachings, and that's fine. It's fine if it's not. Or maybe for some of you, it resonates. I'm offering this because I think it's important that we know about it. This is an integral part of the Buddha's teaching. It just came across in language that is really, really hard to understand. So kind of to wind up this part, I have a little more to say, but to wind up this part, and I'll say I'm offering it because, and I came across this great quote by Yogi Berra, 20th century Buddha or Bodhisattva. He's the pitcher from the 20th century, the New York Yankees, the catcher, New York Yankees. And he said, if you don't know where you are going, you wind up somewhere else. If you don't know where you are going, you wind up somewhere else. So I'm putting before you what the Buddha put before us, and which we can choose to take or not take, whatever, and we benefit from all of it. As the Buddha once said, or maybe more than once, but he did say that about the teaching, it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. So whatever part of it we take, it's good, according to the Buddha. So I wanted to say that I'm going to start, I'm going to, in this meditation, I'm going to give more guidance than usual, than I usually do, and most of us usually do. So please feel free. If you don't want to follow any of this, this is fine. You know, do your own meditation. But I'm just going to go on ahead and give some guidance related to the progress of the talk that I just gave. So I'm inviting you just to settle into an alert and yet relaxed position. And either closing your eyes entirely or leaving them partway open, whatever your preference is. Just being present right now. And taking a deep, long inhale, slowly. And exhale, slowly. And a second inhale. And exhale, out breath. And now, for those of you who care to follow, please turn your attention to sounds. Listening closely. Listening closely to whatever sounds impinge on your ear organ. What sounds are present? And knowing that for some of us, seniors, there may be no sound except for tinnitus and ringing in the ears. That's a sound too. Listening to sounds come and go. Being aware that the sense object of sound, or maybe we'll call it noise, is impinging on the sense organ of your ears. And your ear consciousness is picking that up. It arises. And as a result, hearing happens automatically. Just listening to sounds. Ear consciousness. And now inviting you to turn your attention to body sensations, to sensations that are in your body right now. What objects of consciousness in terms of body sensations are present? Just allowing your consciousness to experience whatever sensations, whatever objects of consciousness arise in terms of physical sensations. These physical sensations are impinging on the organ of the body, the sense organ of the body. Noticing that some of these physical sensations are pleasant, meaning perhaps they're experienced with a sense of warmth or comfort or ease. And some may be unpleasant or downright physically painful. And some may be neutral. All of them are sense objects, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. They're all sense objects, sensations in the body. Noticing when sense objects of thoughts or emotions arise, also called mental formations. Noticing the mind picks them up, registers. That's mind consciousness. Thoughts and emotions may arise and impact on the sense organ, impinge on the sense organ of mind. In mindfulness, we notice and gently and kindly turn our attention, or we can call it now our consciousness, back to the sensations in the body, allowing body consciousness to arise. Noticing the sensations in the body wherever they may be arising. And recognizing this is body consciousness. And now I invite you to allow your attention to focus on a particular kind of body consciousness, and that is on the breath. Resting with your breath, your own natural breath. Body consciousness. The flow of the in-breath and the out-breath. And now switching your attention once again, if you will, opening your eyes and whatever happens to be in front of you, noticing what are the objects in front of you. Sense objects impinging on the eye, producing eye consciousness. Just noticing your eye consciousness at this moment without going into a story, no need for that. And yet if a story does arise, like you look at something in your vicinity and you remember that, wow, you meant to change it, put it in another place, take it away, sell it, give it away, or whatever. Noticing, oh, thought consciousness, mind consciousness, and pulling out. And returning again to sight consciousness. Gently, gently. All of this is very gentle. And you may notice that some of those things that your eye impinge upon your eye organ, maybe some of them are pleasant and you like them. Maybe some of them are unpleasant and for some reason you don't. Or maybe you just pass by others, kind of neutral. All of these are objects that impinge on the organ of the eye and produce eye consciousness. And so consciousness of sense objects, staying close to the way the Buddha's teachings unfolded, mindfulness practice involving consciousness of sense objects. Inviting you right now to notice, if you can, that all of these sense objects that have been impinging on your sense organs and have created sense consciousness, every one of them has been coming and going. And all of them have been in the foreground of your attention. So now the invitation, the question is, can you turn around, step back just even for a moment and notice what is in the background of your attention? Not making a real effort here, just noticing, not trying to prolong, just for an instant, maybe noticing what's in the background of your attention while all of this is happening. What is present when consciousness isn't occupied with objects? And remember, thoughts and emotions are objects too. They're objects of the mind. Not to worry if you can't notice background awareness. It's no problem at all, because I can assure you it's there. You're not going to lose it. It can be noticed anytime. So if at this instant you're not noticing it, that's not a problem. But I'd like to move on now with this meditation. And now we'll do a kind of an envisioning. So I'm going to invite you to envision a cloudy sky. Heavy clouds, gray all over, except for that one small break in the clouds, one hole, one little hole through which the baby blue sky can be seen. So again, we're using imagination here, being a bit creative. So imagining you're standing on the ground and you're looking up at that hole in the sky, that clear blue spot. It's very small. And then somehow, imagining that you're elevating and you're going closer to those clouds. And you don't have to bother about how you're doing it. No need to think this is ridiculous. Just being kind of imaginative and creative. Closer and closer and elevating closer to that hole. And it's getting bigger and bigger than it appeared on the ground. And suddenly you're into it and through it. And you have that airplane experience. Space. Endless, clear, featureless space. Sky everywhere. No limits, no boundaries, no features, no sound, no time. And now, instead of a hole in the clouds, let's imagine that we've moved into that micro space between thoughts instead. Again, you don't have to bother about how did this happen? How'd you move from sky to microspace between thoughts? But just playing around and imagining the microspace between thoughts and moving into that. And as you're moving into it, relaxing completely and realizing it too, like the sky, is endless. It's featureless. There are no boundaries, no sounds, no time, no objects. Yet you are aware. There is awareness. This is consciousness without objects. This is pure awareness. It's your natural state. If thoughts arise and intrude at any time, that is thought consciousness, again, just step back for a moment from thought consciousness. Turn around. Notice what is present, underlying, underpinning those thoughts. Consciousness without object. And now knowing that consciousness without objects, pure awareness, can never be lost. It's always there, even if it appears that you lose sight of it. It doesn't go anywhere. So having taken this imaginary journey, let's return now to consciousness with objects. And I invite you right now, first to come back from this space with no objects, if you will, coming back and allowing attention to rest with your feet. Noticing the touch of your feet on the floor, on the ground, the firmness. Noticing any sensations, body sensations in the feet. And if you wish to allow your attention to engage in any other part of your body or any other practice that you feel comfortable with, please do. And now in closing, I'll remind you again of the Buddha's comment that the Dharma is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end.